In a previous video, I explained the intricacies of the national debt, in particular how a majority of the US national debt is owed to other parts of the US government rather than foreign governments. Two questions came out of the comments section of that video that I thought I should address. One was, why doesn't the federal government just repudiate the intergovernmental debt? Along with that, there were people who asserted that the national debt does not exist. I didn't address these issues in that video because that's not what the video was about, so I'm going to address them here. And so these are the short answers to these questions. To the first question, the federal government is constitutionally obligated to pay the debt. The only way the federal government doesn't pay its debt is if it's financially incapable. As to the assertion that the debt doesn't exist, the short answer is yes. Yes, it does. Let's address the first question. Why doesn't the US government repudiate the intergovernmental debt? The government acquires debt by issuing treasury bonds. A bond is a kind of IOU, where the entity that sells it promises to pay the holder of that bond an amount that was paid for, plus interest. Bonds can be purchased by anybody, individuals, corporations, foreign governments, or even separate entities of the government. Intergovernmental debt is incurred when one department of the government purchases treasury bonds. When this occurs, the US Treasury now owes that department of government the amount paid for the bond plus interest, which essentially means that the government owes itself money. If nearly half the debt is owed to separate departments of the federal government, why can't the federal government just repudiate that debt? Firstly, there are legal reasons. The US Civil War was very expensive. During this time, the federal government enacted the first income tax laws in the nation's history and accumulated debts far greater than ever before and would not be rivaled until the 20th century. There were many people who were afraid that the government would never be able to pay off this debt. So when the 14th Amendment was drafted, Section 4 was added, which states, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. The courts have interpreted this to mean that the federal government is legally required to pay all debts. This is why intergovernmental debt is just as legally binding as debt owed to private citizens or foreign governments. It's constitutionally obligated to pay them. What this means is that if the US government wishes to not pay its debt, this would require one of two things. Either A, a constitutional amendment, or B, the US being financially incapable. It must pay bills in order in which they are due. If the government reaches a point where there is more money due in one day than the government is capable of paying, then they are by definition defaulting. Now, a government has more leverage in these situations than an individual does, but when a government defaults, the consequences are more disastrous. Unless it's a really famous person, when an individual defaults on their debt, it's usually a private affair that has little to no consequence on the economy as a whole. But when a government defaults on its debt, it's public knowledge and the markets react. When an individual goes to the bank seeking a loan to buy a house or start a business, the bank checks that person's financial history to see if they are safe to lend money to. The signs of a person being safe to lend money to is if that person has a history of repaying their loans on time. If this person has a bad track record of repaying their loans, the bank may decide to not lend money to this person. Or if they do, they will charge a higher interest rate to compensate for the risk. The same rules are applied to governments. If a government fails to pay their debt, creditors may be more hesitant to lend them money in the future, and if they do, they will demand higher interest rates to make up for the perceived risk of not getting repaid. There is also another potential market-oriented consequence of defaulting. If individuals or large entities that already own bonds are under the impression that the federal government won't pay them back, they may choose to sell their treasury bonds for less than the printed value, which can lead to further devaluing of bonds to the point where no one is purchasing them. So you see, if the government doesn't pay its debt, it may find it harder to borrow money in the future. And if the federal government finds itself incapable of paying its debt, then there are probably even bigger problems going on that lead to it. The reason intergovernmental debt exists is because having separate parts of government buying treasury bonds is a quicker way of moving money than waiting for Congress to do it. Is there any way, aside from a constitutional amendment, that can make the movement of money from one department to another more cost-effective? One possible answer is to have the departments of government buy zero or negative interest rate bonds. Normally, when someone purchases a bond, it has a positive interest rate, but there are such things as zero and negative interest rate bonds. If you buy a zero yield bond, then you are essentially giving an interest-free loan. If you buy a negative yield bond, then you are giving a loan with a promise to be paid back less than what you loaned. It's obvious why someone or an institution would want to issue such bonds. It's free money. But why would anyone want to buy one of these? The logic behind buying a zero or negative interest bond is for wealth preservation. Imagine you anticipate that you are going to lose 50% of your money in the coming year. And then let's say the government is selling $100 bonds at a negative 1% interest rate. In this instance, it makes sense for you to invest in negative yield bonds because you will lose less money in them than you will in other investments. There are governments that issue these kinds of bonds. Japan, as well as numerous governments in Europe, have been issuing negative yield bonds for a while now, but the US hasn't, and for global financial stability, it can't. So then what about the national debt? Does it actually exist? That question will be answered more fully in part 3. If you want to be notified when that video or any other videos come out, then subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to be notified. Thanks for watching.